Colorado Humanities. So please welcome Jessica.
Good morning. I'm so glad to be with you this morning. Full disclosure, I may be a little bit over-caffeinated, and this is my favorite topic. So if I get really animated and speak too quickly, just feel free to ask me to repeat. I also like to make my sessions a little more interactive, so if you have a question, please just a hand up whenever. We don't need to wait until the end. We're a little early. Remembering questions for the end feels a little excessive at this point, so feel free. I want to start with, because I am from Braintree, Massachusetts, Abigail Adams is very familiar. I am not related to her, but I grew up in such close proximity to her history. It is amazing to me that sometimes I meet people that say, I don't think I know who that is. So we'll just start at the beginning. She married John Adams, a young lawyer who, by all accounts, was destined for greatness. What brought the two of them together was Abigail's love of learning. He fed her curiosity, and she kept his temper in check. Some of his worst outbreaks as a hot-headed Massachusetts patriot was when he was in long absences from Abigail. She really did temper him quite a bit. So they had a remarkable relationship. It was built on mutual respect. He included her in matters of state that most women would not have been included in. And because of that, she has a really unusual experience as a woman at that time. So I just want to make that clear. Their relationship is one for the books, regardless of time period. And that is how we get to where I want to start. How many people are familiar with the Remember the Ladies letter of Abigail's? Just show of hands. Okay, great. I think in the time that I've been researching Abigail, that is the most common point of reference for people. It's a pretty weighty letter. How many people knew that it started with a comment about anti-slavery? That never gets mentioned. So, let's see. I can't really read this letter as me. I have to read it as Abigail. I have sometimes been ready to think that the passion for liberty cannot be equally strong in the breasts of those who have been accustomed to deprive their fellow creatures of theirs. Of this I am certain, that it is not founded upon that generous and Christian principle of doing unto others as we would that others should do unto us. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex is naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity, with impunity? Men of sense, in all ages, abhor these customs which treat us only as the vassal of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by Providence under your protection and in imitation of the Supreme Being, make use of that power only for our happiness. Sometimes people take this letter to mean that she was the first feminist. However, what she's really talking about here is the law of coverture. What Abigail witnessed in the colonies, in her own family, was how this law kept women or kept them rather, very precarious in their status. So this law dictated women's subordinate legal status during marriage. We'll get into more of the details of this, but this is John's response to her. Because they were such great partners, there's a little bit of comic banter back, but this is definitely him shutting down her comments. I won't read it as John because I don't perform as John, but you know, as to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosed the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy, I won't blot it out. Depend on it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly, and in practice, you know we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters, and rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight. I'm sure every good politician would plot, as long as he would, against despotism, empire, monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, and that other one. A fine story indeed. I begin to think the ministry as deep as they are wicked, after storing up the Tories, land jobbers, trimmers, bigots, Canadians, Indians, Negroes, Hanoverians, Hessians, Russians, Irish, Roman Catholics, Scotch renegades. At the last, they have stimulated the women to demand new privileges and threaten to rebel. Abigail, we know from a letter that she sends to her dear friend, Mercy Otis Warren, has her feelings hurt by John's response. You know, he tells me he cannot but laugh. It would be bad policy to grant us greater power, say they, since under all the disadvantages we labor, we have the ascendancy over their hearts. Well, that's all great to be the one who's got your husband's heart, but I cannot say that I think you very generous to the ladies. For whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to all men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things, which are very hard, very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet. I've always wondered if this is sort of a commentary on the play Lysistrata, where the women deny their husbands romantic intercourse in order for them to end the war. And she was a great lover of books and plays, particularly. So it would not be impossible that this is a direct commentary to that. So, coverture. Once married, a woman lost all rights. Any land, any, the clothes on her back, the rights to her children. This law is what Abigail is talking about in Remember the Ladies. So women cannot be sued on her own behalf. She cannot execute a will without her husband's consent, and no control over real personal property. She has no body autonomy. And those are the points that we're going to look at in this timeline of women's rights from Remember the Ladies to now. Even in the freest countries, our property is subject to the control and disposal of our partners, to whom the laws have given a sovereign authority. Deprived of a voice in legislation, obliged to submit to those laws which are imposed upon us, is it not sufficient to make us indifferent to the public welfare? So, William Smith is Abigail's brother. Abigail has her older sister Mary, her younger sister Elizabeth, who she is very close with. But William is the relative, the one they do not speak of. William marries Catherine Louisa Salmon, and they have a fair amount of property. Because this is what Catherine brings to the marriage. William, it is speculated, was not fighting the Battle of Bunker Hill because he was too drunk in a bar. A tavern, as you would say back then. He's not a good businessman. He uses the property as a collateral, defaults on the loan. Now, luckily, it stays in the family. It goes to William's father. And the Reverend Smith is very generous, which is not always the case with a daughter-in-law. He takes really good care of her, and they have a good relationship. Catherine is the daughter-in-law, makes Reverend Smith's grandchildren really available to him. He loves being a part of the family. She feels very taken care of. But then, Reverend Smith dies. So this property and the woodlot are placed in the hands of executors. The income is to take care of her and the children as long as his son lives. Again, this is extremely generous at the time. William does not live a long life, and after he dies, the property goes on to support the children. She gets the largest inheritance of all the Smith family, even though she's only a daughter-in-law. The whole family knew that William was not a good provider. He was not a good husband. There was a lot of neglect. In fact, Abigail takes her niece, named Louisa. When she's just young, Louisa lives with the Adamses through the remainder of their life. She cares for them in their old age. Basically, they raise Louisa as another child because of her brother's inability to care for and protect his family. So, Louisa is well taken care of, but she never gets back the title to the property that she came to the marriage with. So, criminal conversation, CrimCon for short, is what's brought by the husband against the man who was alleged to have committed adultery with his wife. It was an action for damages, sometimes large sums of money. The wife was not party to the action. She never had an opportunity to defend her name. But yet she would wear that title as adulteress. Yeah, the big scarlet A. Yeah, she might not wear it, in an actual piece on her chest, but she wore it. Those communities were small and well connected. What does a woman do? What if it's the husband that is practicing adultery? Nothing. Criminal conversation is not available to women. The most they could get is this divorce, a mensa et thoro, which allowed her to live apart but had no protections as a single woman. If you were a single woman, you could have property. If you were a single woman, you could even maybe have the opportunity to have money coming from a relative to help support you. But if you were married, you had no option at that. So this I thought was interesting. Abigail dies at a time when, it's 1818. We're still very much in coverture. But Abigail did a lot of things in her life that were not what a well-behaved woman would do. Because the relationship with John was so strong, she was able to speak out and do certain things. But I'm getting ahead of myself and I'm going out of order. So I'm going to stop for a minute. So this, she has no means of enforcing the law. She has no protections. She is homeless, helpless, hopeless, and almost destitute of civil rights. Now, even after we declared independency from Britain, our laws were still very much the laws of Britain, especially when it came to marital property and rights to the children. So, character may be mercilessly defamed. Abigail wanted so much for women to be held in an esteem that the behavior of the husbands would not only not make them destitute, but would not reflect poorly on them. Reputation was everything. In order to be eligible for a second marriage, you certainly could not have had your name defamed. You needed to stay marketable, so to speak. So this really, in these slight moments, things that today we might think, what's the big deal? Someone spoke ill of her, but anyone who knows her knows that's not true. It's a little different today. Back then, a word against your propriety was a very big deal. And it was a very big deal because men could also, sort of knowing that that was a big deal, make a threat, get their wives to fall in line. It should be known that a woman, if found guilty of adultery, will forfeit, as far as this court is concerned, all rights to the custody or access. Could you imagine, in today's day and age, a court saying you could not even see your children, not even supervise, no access? And this is always interesting. In contrast to her position as to the legitimate children, a mother had all the rights to her illegitimate children, and the father none. Central to the thinking of both situations was the rights of the parent. The welfare of the child did not enter into the equation. Children were really sort of the prize in a lot of relationships. And we don't see care to their well-being until much, much later on. This was the last of this that I wanted to share. So, this case, the king against de Manville. The husband is a Frenchman. France and England are at war. So he is an enemy. He is like subject to being deported. But before he is deported, he found by means, by force and stratagem, to get into the house where she, his former wife, was, and had forcibly taken the child, an 8-month-old, then at the breast, and carried it away almost naked in an open carriage in inclement weather. So this is a man who's going to be deported. The court gives him custody of this child. This is an extreme case, but this is what I mean about there was no recourse for women with their own children, let alone title to a property. Some of the judges would have done it differently if they could, but the law was the law. How many women in here are mothers? Have you ever thought that you would be kept from seeing your children? You know, it happened in my lifetime that father, you know, when I was younger and my parents divorced, the mother got custody, you know, and in the last 30 years, fathers have been let back in. But prior to, it was all about the husbands. So, now we're going to talk about the ways in which Abigail did things a little differently. Because she watched her brother's husband, or her brother's wife, have such a hard time. You know, they moved, there was not enough money while William was at the helm of the family. She watched it in other friends. She even, her son Charles, Charles leaves his wife and children destitute. He leaves. He also, there was a fair amount of alcoholism in the Adams family, and he succumbed to it at age 30. But before that, you know, she's watching her daughter-in-law and grandchildren be affected by the disease of intemperance. Abigail has to make money when John goes to the Continental Congress. He can't practice law while he is doing this service for his country, and there is no remuneration for his time at the Congress. They have a farm. Abigail grows most of what she needs. She is very industrious. The Yankee, ingenuity. But there are some things that she just cannot create. You know, she cannot manufacture for herself. She also has property taxes. So she gets really smart. They close the port of Boston. Nothing's coming in, nothing's going out. And John is in Philadelphia. And you may all, especially if you've seen several plays, quote Abigail. Pins, John, pins! She writes to John and says, please send me pins, as many pins as you can send me. And these are straight pins, and they were used for everything, not the least putting on their very elaborate clothing, everything pinned together. And so if you couldn't manufacture pins, you needed them. So in 1775, he sends her 6,000 pins, and thus starts her side gig, her side hustle. She gets these goods, she sells them to family and friends, and she makes a little bit of money. which she calls hers. Completely not allowed by the law of coverture. John gets that she's keeping the family afloat. He's very grateful. He's always had a great vision for this country. He wants his time to go there. So the fact that Abigail's managing everything at the farm, perfect. He's good with that. When he goes to Europe, he's sending back handkerchiefs and silk gloves and things of that nature. And Abigail keeps this up. But she also is a speculator. John loved to invest in land. Abigail liked to invest in paper money. And so, can she do this as a woman? Nope. But she has an uncle, Cotton Tufts is his name. I know, cute name. You'll never forget it. And he is her agent. He does her bidding for her. Because, of course, John's away and she needs a man. He steps in. And she has great faith in him, and he steers her well. You know, in this letter, she's saying, you know, you'll invest the 200 pounds. And what do you think of selling the house in Boston? They frequently have property in Boston. John, before he goes to the Continental Congress, they live in Boston, and it's like a law office and their home. And so, you know, at that point, she's saying, what do you think? Should we sell it? Invest the money? So 1839, England enacts the Custody of Infants Act. Judge gets to use his discretion. The act permitted a mother to petition the courts for custody of her children up to the age of 7. Now it's important to remember that age 7 back in 1839 is a little different than age 7 today. At age 11, John Quincy Adams goes to Europe with his father as his secretary, and then leaves his father's care and goes and works for other diplomats, going to The Hague, he goes to Russia, all before he's 16 years old. So you've got to remember that a 7-year-old today is pretty sheltered, far more sheltered than 7 then. But could you imagine that you could only have custody until age 7? Married Women's Property Act passes in 1848, state of New York. So obviously here, she'll own it. If she owns it at the time of marriage, it's not, her husband does not have sole right to it. Sole and separate property as if she were a single female. Except so far as to say may be liable for the debts of her husband heretofore contracted in their marriage. This is huge. She can get gifts from her family. She can get inheritance, and she can keep it to herself. So, 30 years after Abigail dies, this is when this law comes into effect. So, the Saucy Mrs. Adams, with that money that she called hers, she uses it. She built up quite a little nest egg. And when they are coming back from Europe, they decide to invest in a larger home. Their original farm is 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs. They go to Europe and they live in a villa with 56 rooms. Abigail says, I'm not sure I went into every one. It's huge. And so she's in Europe and the ceilings are very tall and it's very grand. And she's thinking to herself, I'm gonna go back to that farm. So she starts contracting with Uncle Tufts, you know, hey, I heard so-and-so's property might be available. Could you see if we might be able to secure that? She cashes in some of that paper money. And it's really Abigail's smart maneuvering that they're able to purchase the property known as Peacefield, the larger farm. that they then retired to after the vice presidency and presidency. She continues. She's smart. She knows what her family and friends want. She knows how to import things. That nest egg, in her final act of sauciness, she draws up a will, and she leaves the money which she calls hers only to her female heirs. And John, as a last act of devotion to her, honors and executes the will as she writes it. So this is what I mean. The candor she can have with John is because his partnership is so solid. Her female heirs mostly are very grateful for this. Louisa Catherine, married to John Quincy Adams, says this isn't right, and she just passes it on to her sons. But all the other female heirs, it is such a huge step in the right direction, 30 years before this law comes into play. All contracts made between persons remain in full force after the marriage takes place. So she would not have needed Uncle Tufts had she lasted 30 more years. In 1857, this case in Massachusetts, the first in the U.S., to recognize the contract justification for the marital defense to rape. You'll remember that the law of coverture is body autonomy, and women had none. If you were married, the deal was you agreed to this. It was grounds for divorce, and this defense became part of the rape laws in every state, the marriage exemption. 1860, concerning the rights and liabilities of husband and wife. This gives greater detail, as to the property and real estate rights. And here we see in that second paragraph, joint guardian of her children with her husband, with equal powers, rights, and duties in regard to them with the husband. So I heard some people saying, I want to go to that suffrage talk. that Abigail's giving. And so she wasn't into suffrage. It was really the law of coverture. But I found this really interesting as we speak of the suffrage movement. So, we know Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Anthony, as a single woman, was the one who signed all the contracts for the Suffrage Association. Because as a single woman, a femme soul, she had the right to sign. So Stanton's husband would have had to sign on the Women's Suffrage Association. I just found that really curious. So, now we're getting into the timeline that I know. So my mom, Patricia Downing, marries Ed Ford. She retains her maiden name and insists on being called Ms. Downing. As a girl, I was annoyed to have two last names, Downing Ford. People made fun of me. I cannot even tell you how many teachers would I have one teacher, Jessica Downing Ford, Lincoln Chrysler. You know, it was always a joke. You know, it was always a joke. So as a kid, I wasn't a big fan of it, and I didn't understand why Ms. was so important. I get both of those names, and 1973, U.S. Supreme Court ruled the Constitution of the United States conferred the right to have an abortion in the landmark Roe v. Wade decision, which again falls under the body autonomy from that law of coverture. 1974, Equal Credit Opportunity Act. How many women had to have a husband or a father co-sign their first divorce? Co-sign an educational loan? Yeah.
My feminazi started on this topic.
I get the privilege of working with fourth grade students as a young Chautauqua coach. And it's interesting when some of these girls discover that in my timeline, you know, I was one of the first generations who could get a credit card on my very phone. Which I love because they usually tell me you're not that old, which is so great. The women's movement in the 70s, changes in the law. Now, I didn't know this, Nebraska, congratulations, became the first state to throw out its marital rape exemption clause. 17 years later, all 50 states had revoked their marital rape exemptions. That's the year I graduated college. In 77, recognized sexual harassment in the workplace. Who put up with honey baby sweetie and some inappropriate office interaction, right? You know, when I start to realize this timeline, I understand why that Ms. was really important to my mom. That her value in standing in the world was not based on who she was married to, but in her own right. But let's be honest here. Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 made it illegal to fire a woman for being pregnant. Any of you have to conceal a pregnancy to keep a job a little bit longer? There are several well-known women. Ruth Bader Ginsburg hides both of her pregnancies because she's teaching at a college. And she hides them and luckily times them out pretty good so that she goes on summer leave and has these babies. She was a teeny little thing. She could hide it well. But this is after, you know, this is in that early to mid 70s. And of course we know Roe v. Wade was reversed. June 24th, 2022. It's a quote of Abigail's I love. I excerpted it a little bit earlier. What she's saying here is, if we're not protected, if we're not represented, if we don't have a voice, how can we be expected to care? If we have no stake in the game, if we can't hold a public office, why do we care? what happens in our country. As the rights of women to their children, to their body autonomy, to their property came into play, women were able to stand on their own in a new way, more than just financially. You know, Abigail always wanted education to be equal opportunity for women. How many women got a college education in the room? Were able to go and attend. That was really a big part of what Abigail wanted. When she goes to Europe and she gets to go to scientific lectures on electricity and magnetism in large lecture halls with men and women, oh, she's smitten by it. She writes home as if she has visited this new and enchanting land. And a lot of these rights that we've received have happened in a really short chunk of time. A late writer observes that as citizens we are called upon to exhibit our fortitude, for when you offer your blood to the state, it is ours. In giving it our sons and our husbands, we give more than ourselves. You can only die on the field of battle, but we have the misfortune to survive those whom we love most. Abigail so loved her family. She did not lose any children on the battlefield, but she did lose children. I just found that so poignant, how many losses. There were the Battle of Bunker Hill, you know, husbands, brothers, sons. Some families lost all their males, you know, in the Revolution. And that is a unique place for a woman to stand. So, more current here. Again, just the difference between what is said even still. Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor her, and keep her in sickness and in health? Wilt thou obey him? Is the first thing. This too, I was at a wedding not long ago. The obey, still very much in there. This source that I found, Until They Are 7, was really helpful with a lot of the facts of those legal cases in what changed the rights of women over the course of time. And that's it. So, questions, comments, curiosity? Yes.
When you were talking about Abigail's sisters, all that, it reminded me of, I've been listening to an audiobook of Alexander Hamilton and his mother, that same status. That was
Yes.
pretty enlightening.
Absolutely. And again, you know, talk about, I mean, it comes up a lot that Hamilton is a bastard. And that is, I mean, he really starts life with several strikes against him. Amazing how he could rise. And not, again, the American dream, right? But women didn't have that luxury. They didn't get to outlive whatever title they got, especially adulteress. Did you have vision?
Are the same things going on in Europe concurrently with women there?
Absolutely. These laws were happening in Europe, mostly in Britain, and like I said, even after the Revolution and the Declaration and our independency, we followed suit very much with Europe's laws. And so it is going hand in hand. Women, what I found really interesting is the theme over and over again that, you know, middle and upper class women, which Abigail was, had a lot more freedom because they produced what they needed on their farm. They had more means. You know, as is frequently the case, those with money could circumvent some of these laws. You know, there were cases in really wealthy families where there was basically the equivalent of a prenup done, but property and monies had to be in trusts, and it involved lots of attorneys, and so it was not common practice. But it could be done. But for the common woman, they were completely at the mercy of their husbands. I've thought quite a bit about doing a composite character of a camp follower to the Continental Army. You know, Abigail didn't have to fall in line and follow her husband in the service to our country. But women who did not have property in the family that they were attached to followed the military. They brought their kids, they did laundry, they cooked, they did what they could do to assist the troops, but they were really there because they had nowhere else to be. So money has always played heavily on whether or not women have protections or not. But it's interesting to know that there were probably a couple thousand women and children following George Washington and the Continental Army through the course of the Revolution. And that life for them, I can't imagine the hardships. I have raised kids on my own, but I did not have to be subject to war and essentially live on the front lines with them. I can't imagine what that would have been like. Any other questions? Yes, in the back with the beard. Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Did Abigail have any big influence like on her children? Like, did we see like any of like her ideas? Like Quincy really listened to her a lot and perpetuate what she wanted.
Yeah, Abigail and John really poured themselves into John Quincy Adams. She knew right away that he would do great things. She does not live long enough to see him become president. But she was enamored by him, and he, you know, of all the kids, he achieves the most. But did Abigail, Abigail told everyone what she thought they should be doing. She was pretty involved and even tried to, you know, manipulate some outcomes. When she goes to Europe, she brings her daughter, Abigail, they call her Nabby, with her, you know, because it's a really great learning opportunity. You know, her daughter doesn't get to go to Harvard like all the sons do. So Abigail uses that to, you know, like broaden her understanding of the world, but it's also because she doesn't like the man that's courting her at the time. So she's like, let's see if this makes the heart grow fonder. I'm gonna take her with me. So she was a very hands-on parent, yes. There were a couple other questions right over in this area. Yes?
I know that she corresponded with women of like mind.
Mm-hmm.
But how was she regarded by the general public? Did people go around saying, well, like, John's got his hands full here, or everybody knows that, you know, she's different?
So she has a lot of respect. Thomas Jefferson adored her. She's smart, she's capable. Generally, people liked her. But depending upon what side of the political aisle you were on for the 1800 election, you know, the papers were calling them the Duke and Duchess of Braintree. She was absolutely aghast at that. They called her Mrs. President. implying that her opinion was an overreach, that John should be making up his own mind. But most people that knew her liked her. It was more how she got portrayed in the media and the ways that people got at John with the comments about Abigail. I think I have time for one last question. Yes?
Do you know what Martha Washington's stance was, or if they talked about anything? And I know she was a widow. She brought a lot of property into her marriage, didn't she?
She did. Martha gave George the standing he'd always wanted in life. And Abigail really admired Martha, thought she was just the most gracious host that she ever interacted with. But did she and Martha talk politics and law of coverture? I don't have any evidence of that. What I have of Abigail's words are the letters that she wrote. And she and Martha didn't write a lot of letters because they were, for that, span of 8 years, fairly in close contact with each other. So I don't know what sort of conversations they had together. I don't have indication that Martha was so bold in her opinions and ideals.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you all for coming. Just a reminder, there is a QR code inside your booklet. If you could scan that and do the survey, we would appreciate it. Thank you all for coming, and thank you again for your service.